Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Coffee with Thorben. I hope you have a great day and you're healthy and everything. So yeah, if you have any questions we shall talk about today, please post them in the chat. Until you've done that, I've prepared a few questions myself that I found on the blog and on Stack Overflow and stuff. So yeah, we will have a few things to talk about today. Hi Refking. Yeah, so first thing I want to quickly touch on is the redesign and rebranding that you see here on the screen, and I will also update the YouTube channel probably within this week. So yeah, Thoughts on Java org is now torbenjanssen.com. But yeah, that's basically everything that changed, and I did a few design changes on the site. You can see that here. But basically everything else stays the same. So you still get the same kinds of articles there. The layout almost looks the same as before. The URL structure is the same, so you can keep all the bookmarks that you might have, and they will still work. So yeah, basically not a lot has changed. It just looks a little bit different. Okay, so let's take a look at the question that RefKing posted in the chat. Why don't you publish Hibernate JPA tutorials on Udemy? Well, the main reason for that is that I don't think that Udemy is a good place to publish courses in which you put in a lot of effort. And it's not very beneficial as a platform for content creators. I prefer to produce high quality courses that have a lot of depth and a certain length to it. And doing that on a platform like Udemy, which dictates the price and the discounts they are running and all these kind of things, and just give which just gives a very small share to the creator of the course, is actually not sustainable. So yeah, I will keep offering my courses on my site. Zini asks, hello, can you talk about performance enhancement in today's talk? Sure. Do you have a specific question about it? So in general, there are a few things that will help you to create a to define a good persistence layer with JPA and Hibernate. And the first thing you should do is you should try to create a simple domain model. And that's right. The mapping of the domain model to the table model should be simple. The smaller the gap that Hibernate has to bridge between your entity classes and your database tables, the better. And the next thing you should try to do is to use as few queries as possible to fetch your data. That means you need to think about which association do you need in your use case, and then use a join fetch clause to get them, or an entity graph. Yeah, avoid fetch type eager for basically all cases. It's very rare that you have a situation in which fetch type eager actually makes sense. It is not just a performance burden. What else should you think about? Yeah, you should use the right projection for your use case, which means you should use DTOs for read-only operations because you can design them specifically for the use case and they don't have any management overhead. And you should use entities for write operations. Yes, they are a little bit slower than DTOs, but you get the full lifecycle management and the association management provided by JPA, which makes implementing write operation way easier. Yeah, that would be my general recommendations for Hibernate performance optimizations. Sini, if you have a specific question, then please post it in the chat and I will dive deeper into that topic. Otherwise, I would recommend to take a look at the performance tuning section here under tutorials, JPA and Hibernate. And there we have performance, and here are a few performance tuning articles, which then provide more links to further articles, which you can then study, or you take a look at my Hibernate performance tuning online course. These would give you a general overview over the most important performance tuning topics. But yeah, if you have a specific question, feel free to post it here in the chat, and I will try to answer it. Rochio asked, will you rename this channel as well? Yes, I will rename it as well. So the whole renaming and redesign thing happened a little bit sooner than I intended to implement it. There were some technical issues with the web hosting server that I was using, and the web hosting company basically recommended that we migrate everything to a new server, and that would cause a short downtime. So I decided, okay, if I have the downtime right now, then I also do the rebranding to thorben.com, which was actually planned for the end of this month. So I thought I would have another week or two to prepare everything, and yeah, we then pulled it off in a weekend. So yeah, this channel will get renamed. The Facebook page that you can see in the footer will be renamed. But yeah, it's just a renaming, right? So everything stays the same. You can even still use the old thoughtsonjava.org domain. It gets automatically redirected to the new one. Wilder69 asks why OIMS not works mostly in case of huge database. Well, that depends on the mapping and the features that you are using. Object relation and mapping frameworks, and that of course includes Hibernate, provides certain default behaviors, like with Hibernate, the fetching of associations, or the management of associations in general. And these tend to work not very efficient if the associations are huge. So if you have an association between, let's say, books and reviews in an online bookstore, then you might have a few thousand reviews in your database. With SQL, you would probably never try to fetch all of these reviews within one query. With JPA and Hibernate, that can happen by accident, just because you use the set that maps that association on your entity class. So the risk there is that you don't check your SQL statements, you don't really think about what's happening internally when you work with your entity classes, or entity objects in that case. And that might trigger SQL statements which you would never manually execute, because if you would write them yourself, you would start thinking about it and recognize, well, it might not be a good idea to fetch 7,000 reviews, right? Well, calling the get reviews method and then doing something on that list that you get back from that method, that doesn't look too scary. So that's something that's easily implemented. Yeah. So yeah, working with huge associations is a reason why object relation and mapping frameworks can be problematic on huge databases. Another thing could be that all object relation and mapping frameworks, as long as at least the ones that I know, provide a record-centric approach. So one object maps one database record, and you always perform your operations on this one object, which is something that you don't usually do in SQL. It feels totally natural in an object-oriented language, but in SQL, you would work on a group of records, right? So, I mean, you would do an SQL update statement with a certain where condition, and that where condition would most likely fit to multiple records. You can't do that with Hibernate. There you would do, or at least not based on entities. With Hibernate, you would do the operation on each entity object. So it's a record-focused approach, and that is not efficient if you work on huge data sets. But yeah, that is not actually necessarily an issue of huge databases. It's more an issue of working on a huge set of records that you use for need for your use case. Yeah, while you probably recognize the question isn't, it's a little bit too generic to answer it easily within a few sentences. Yeah. Let's take a look at Rotko's question. A many-to-one association to an entity which has multiple collection association. Is it possible to join fetch collections without getting duplicates? I know it's possible with sets. You have a many-to-one association to an entity which has multiple collection associations. Is it possible to join fetch collections without getting duplicates? To join fetch collections on child duplicates. Okay. Yeah. So there doesn't make any difference if you model the association as a set or as a list. You might need to use a distinct keyword on the selected entity to remove duplicates, and you might need to set the query hint pass distinct through to false, so that it gets not sent to the database and it's just applied to the result set mapping. But in general, you can avoid duplicates when you're using a joint fetch. One thing you need to be aware of is that using multiple joint fetches within a query is problematic. First, please explain the distinct issue a little bit further. I think I didn't understand your question correctly. But let me finish this thought real quick. So using multiple joint fetches in one statement is critical because it creates a huge product in your result set, and that can cause tremendous performance issues when fetching when creating the query result in the database and when fetching that data from the database. So you should in general be careful with using multiple joint fetch clauses. And if you want to do that and say, okay, my associations only contain a few elements, the product isn't too big, then you need to model it as a set instead of a list. So let me reread your first question. A many-to-one association. Okay, so you want to fetch a many-to-one association that has, and then fetch the child these other associations on that fetched entity as well? I'm sorry, I think I don't really understand the question. Maybe you can post a code sample somewhere that I could take a look at. Merck asks, what do you think about outsourcing IT projects to Eastern Europe? I mean, cheap labor. Well, I mean that totally depends on the development team that it's then doing the work. Do they know what they are doing, or are they just cheap developers? I worked with both kinds of teams in Eastern Europe and in Asia. Totally independent of the price. Some knew what they were doing, and working with them was great. Others didn't really knew what they were doing, and with some of them, I even felt like they probably spent more time with other programming languages. Well, and these outsourcing projects sucked, but well, that's not really an issue for companies or teams in Eastern Europe or Asian countries or wherever. That's just a general thing. If a team that knows what they are doing is working on a project, that's great. If you outsource a Java project and the team is normally doing C++, then that project will probably suck. Tini asked about the distinct keyword. How expensive, performance-wise, is distinct root entity of Hibernate? I haven't used that feature for ages. Do you know if it adds a distinct to the select statement, or is it just performed on the reside set? If it's performed on the reside set, it's relatively cheap. If it's part of the SQL statement, it's expensive. That's the reason why why you should use the pass distinct through Hibernate query hint when using a distinct in your JPQA query. That should not be part of the SQL statement. Theodore asks, is it possible using JPA to perform aggregations with dynamic group by that is set on the runtime the field that should be grouped? Well, you have two options there. Either you create a JPQA query with a specific group by clause that you define at runtime. That's probably not a great idea because it most likely requires string concatenation. And that would be my recommended approach for all dynamically created queries. You take a look at the JPA criteria API, which provides you with a type-safe way to create queries dynamically at runtime. So that gets often used if you have a complex search dialog on the client. The user fills in certain fields in that dialog, and based on the input, you need to decide which associations you need to join, how the where condition looks, if you need to apply group bys, and if you need to do ordering and all these kind of stuff. So there you have a Java API that enables you to create the query dynamically at runtime. And if you combine that with the JPA meta model, you can do that in a type-safe way as well. You can find a few articles about that on my blog, and it's a huge part in the advanced Hibernate course. Mani Sankar asks, is join column be always present at the many side of association? No. You can define a many-to-one association without a join column. If you do that, then Hibernate uses its default mapping for the foreign key column. It uses the name of the association, or the name of the attribute that maps the association on that entity, followed by an underscore, followed by the name of the primary key attribute of the referenced entity. If you want to customize that mapping, then you need to join column annotation. And then you can use the name attribute and set the name of the join column to whatever you like. Wolfgang asks, did you have any online source where all of us to discuss the contents and doubts? Well, you can post your questions here on the channel, or if it's so below a video that matches the topic, or you can do the same on the on my blog. There's a comment section below the articles. But besides that, no, I don't. Okay, so let me get back into the browser and try to answer a few questions here. Let's close this and start with a comment that I got on YouTube a while ago. So here someone asked for a video to set up distributed caching. That's still on my to-do list. More interesting. No, that's the wrong window. Right, I will get back to that later. Then let's work on this and start with the question here from Sasa. Is there a way to use join fetch on native query? I have lazy initialization exception problem and use join fetch to solve it on some queries, but have some complex query implemented via native query. How can I make it to act as a join fetch? Well, unfortunately, there is no join fetch option for native queries. The only thing let me think real quick, could you do something similar with native queries? No, not really. I mean, you could fetch all the, you could join the database tables and fetch all their columns and then try to map them to entities. But if you want to get entities out of that, the whole thing is pretty difficult. So the only thing you could do is to perform multiple queries. Each of these queries returns one kind of entity class. And the next step, you can then merge the results. Okay, so Iga asks, is it possible to retrieve the same result, object array with books and authors, with Hibernate criteria query? How you go, Iga? Hibernate's criteria query is deprecated and will be removed in Hibernate 6. And you can use JPA's criteria query instead. It's pretty similar, and you can do the same using Multiselect, and you can select multiple entity classes using the Multiselect method on the query interface. That should be a criteria query interface. Okay, I will keep this one open because I want to find out more about it here. Explain it in more detail. I need to get the link for that after this call. Hi Mahmoud. Sir Wolfgang, sir, please create an online community on Discuss platform where all of us can join in that community and be part of it. Well, Wolfgang, you can send me a link to where you think a good place for an online community could be, and I then take a look at it and decide if that's really a fit. So Mahmoud asks, thanks for explaining. Can we create abstract repository and service for JPA repository? If it's possible, how can we use abstract services? So Mahmoud, what do you want to achieve with the abstract repository? I mean, it sounds like you're asking for Spring JPA, a Spring Data JPA repository, and there you could of course extend the JPA repository interface. But what do you actually want to do? Igor, are you the Igor who asked the question on the blog? So yeah, with JPA's criteria query, you can select multiple things. So let me, you can, I think you asked about this one here, and you can do exactly the same with JPA's criteria query. What you would do there is you would call instead of the select method, you normally call the select method on the criteria query. And if you want to select 2 entity objects per record, then you would call the multiselect method with reference to both entities, and you would define a left join between the author and the books entity, and then it's easily doable. Yes, I think you should be able to post a link. Give it a try, please. So Bob said, can we say that persistence context is an area of memory which contains the managed entities? Yeah, in general, yes. That's at least part of the persistence context, yeah. Persistence context contains all managed entities. And it's part of, well, it's an area of memory as well. So yeah, that sentence is definitely not wrong. There's a little bit more that gets into that is part of the persistence context, but yes, this is also the persistence context. Okay, let's take a question from another post. How to generate primary keys with JPA and Hibernate. And Bihan asks, very interesting. I think I'm struggling to use generated value of non-ID column with custom sequence generator. How is that possible? Yeah, I took a look at the Java doc because I wanted to be absolutely sure that I answered this correctly. And I was right. The generated value annotation is or should only be used for primary key attributes. So as you can see here, the generated value annotation may be applied to a primary key property, blah, 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 blah. In conjunction with the ID annotation, the use is only required to be supported for simple primary keys. So yeah, it would be nice if we could do something like this. So if we could use a primary key generator to generate a technical ID that should not become the primary key or something like that, but unfortunately that's not possible. So we need this URL. For primary key attributes. See. Okay, well, if it's not allowed to post links here, thanks for the update, Oliver. Then can you send it to me on Twitter? I will open up my Twitter in a second window and take a look there. And for next time, I will come up with a solution on how to share links. Maybe you can share the link if you put in a few random links, blanks in the URL. Maybe that helps. Okay, well, then I had a few Stack Overflow questions that I wanted to talk about. So here we have a one-to-one mapping that's triggering n+1 queries. Let's take a look at that. I'm trying to make a one-to-one mapping following the... Oh yeah, that's a pretty good article from Vlad, and we well, you can find a similar article on about that on my blog. We both share the same ideas there for mapping of one-to-one associations. So the general idea there is to make the mapping between or the mapping of a one-to-one association, to make it unidirectional, and to define it only on the entity that contains the foreign key column, and then use the maps ID annotation on that association to use the foreign key also as the foreign key as the primary key of that entity, because you can then you then don't need to have a bidirectional association, because if you're, well, let's say you have a book and a manuscript. If you define the association on the manuscript and say, okay, my manuscript shares the primary key value of the book, then you don't need an association on the book entity to the manuscript entity. If you need the manuscript, you can just do a find by ID with the primary key value of the book. And the reason for all of that is that lazy fetching for one-to-one associations only works on the entity that maps the foreign key column. On the other entity, it would be an eager fetching always, because Hibernate needs to know if it has to initialize the association with null or with a proxy object, and that requires a database query. And at some point, the Hibernate team decided, well, if we need to define or execute a query anyways, then we can get the whole object instead of just checking if there's a primary key. Okay, Oliver, I got your question. I will answer it after this one here. So the query is being made on the parent entity service, and it's triggering n+1 queries. How can I improve this code to only make one query? We don't need to access the parent details in this case. So this is the parent, this is the parent details. Here we have the mapping that I described. So this is the entity that stores the foreign key attribute, or that has the foreign key column on the database table, and it has a maps ID annotation. And because of that, the primary key value of this parent gets used as the primary key value, as the value of the ID here. But the mapping looks it's a bidirectional mapping. Yeah, that's the main issue here. The issue is you wouldn't use the you wouldn't model it as a bidirectional mapping. You want to get rid of this part here. And instead of fetching the parent details via a mapped association, you would do a find call on that entity. Okay. Yeah, Rotko, I got your link. I will take a look at it in a minute. So let me write up the answer here. If you want to avoid the additional queries, you need to model the association. Model unidirectional association between parent details and parent. Your code snippet. In your example, that would mean that you need to remove the details attribute from your parent entity. Because your parent details object uses the same ID value as the entity, uses the same as the parent entity, you don't need that association. Don't need the needed bidirectional association. If you want to get the parent details object entity for a parent entity, you can simply you can that by and do that. You can get it. Method. Okay, now we need a little bit of code here. So we take this and remove that, and this is code. And then find p get id parent details dot class. Okay, let's quickly write a sentence why the actual queries happen. Hibernate executes the additional queries, and because the parent entity doesn't map the foreign key column. Hibernate doesn't support lazy fetching for that end of the association. Association. And executes the additional queries because the parent entity doesn't map the front key column. Hibernate doesn't support lazy fetching for that end of the association because it has to perform at some point. The team decided that if they have the end of the association during instantiation of when Hibernate instantiates its a parent object, it needs to check if the primary, if it needs to initialize the association with the proxy or null object, and at some point the team decided that they would fetch the associated entity instead of entity if they are frost from query anyways. Let me quickly get a link to that. So and then this one. Let's see, that's the right one. Explained that in more detail here. Right, and that is now Thorben.com, of course. A link. Okay. Yeah, let's post that answer, and now I take a look at the chat and the questions that you just sent me. So Trunk, sorry, I have no clue how to pronounce your name, asks, why do we need criteria query? Never think of using it. Don't dynamic query works just fine with JPQL or native query? Yes and no. Sure, you can create a native query, or you can use a JPQL query or a native query and build the queries, the query, which is just a string, dynamically at runtime by concatenating strings and just building your query statement. That's something that you can do, sure. But creating a query by concatenating string is error prone. It doesn't feel very comfortable, right? And the criteria query provides you a Java API that allows you to do exactly the same, just in a type-safe way and with a strong, well-defined API. I mean, sure, we can complain a lot about the criteria API. It has, well, I'm not a huge fan of it. It's hard to read. It's very verbose. But if you get used to it, you will recognize that it's actually a well-designed API. It uses just a relatively small set of concepts and does that very consistently. So if you use it a few times, then you will not have any issues to create your query with that. And then you get type safety and additional support to create a good working, to create a correct query. So yeah, you're right, it's only an alternative to creating your query string dynamically, but I think it's the better alternative. Okay, so that was Oliver's question. Hi Torben, hope you there's a question related to edit Hibernate managed entities focusing on a strange behavior that occurs when one modifies an entities collection-based relation. Say there's a unidirectional many-to-many relation between author and book. Author has a list of books she has written, and I would like to add 2 new books to the list. Okay. Other than the expected behavior of the 2 new book persisted to the book table, Hibernate deletes. Yeah. Hibernate deletes all records associated to this author from the join table and reinserts them list as a back internally and treats it as an unordered, unindexed collection. Probably this behavior legitimates the aforementioned problem, but how can we avoid it? The fix to that is relatively simple. Use a set instead of a list. I have to point out for you that although set solves the problem because of its unique data structure, I don't want to change the data type of the collection if it's not necessary because there are numerous code logic already depending on the current collection type. Is there a different way to do that? No, I think there isn't. Also try to save the book instances before adding them to the author's collection with equal hash code based on ID to acquire ID from Hibernate, but that did not help either. I guess Hibernate just does not care about distinguishing the objects in a persistent back. Yeah, unfortunately, that's right. So if it's treated as a back, so back is an Hibernate internal concept for a collection type. So Hibernate distinguishes between a list and a back, and unfortunately, to create a really confusing setup, the Java util list is usually mapped as or handled as a back in Hibernate. So a back for Hibernate is an unordered collection type, which normally, if you don't provide any order, the settings is the case for a too-many association. So in that case, it's treated as a back, and for a back, Hibernate shows this really annoying behavior if you're trying to change elements in a many-to-many association. So if you add something or if you remove something from that list, Hibernate removes all records from the association table and then reinserts them. That creates a lot of effort or a lot of work on the database, and Hibernate needs to generate lots of statements. And if you're auditing the association table, then the audit log will get filled with just useless records. I mean, these are just statements that should never happen. So yeah, the only solution that I have for that issue is to use a set instead of a list. I understand that you don't want to change all of that, but unfortunately I don't have a better solution. Okay, now to the question by Biotico. Okay, so we have an interview request. Select distinct R from interview request R, join fetch R.techie T, left join fetch T dot skills. Okay. Many to one association to techie, and techie has a one to many association to skills. If there are 2 interview requests with the same techie, yeah, I get skill duplicates with using list for collections. where the most obvious and easiest way to solve it would be to use a set on the to map the skills association on the techie. In general, I would always recommend to use a set instead of a list for too-many association. But I'm wondering if there's something that's a little less invasive to the current code base. Maybe something that doesn't require you to change the entity mapping. Okay, so what you just wrote that he changed the data type, and he's now using a list, a set instead of a list for the too many association. Well, I expect that between techie and skills, we have a many-to-many association. That means that multiple techies can have the same skill. Because that's probably, Java or web development or something like that. And in that case, you can probably only use a set. I'm wondering if we can do something based on a group by clause, or because we can't apply a distinct there. No, but all of that shouldn't work. Yeah, I think the only thing you can do here is to use a set to model the too many association instead of a list. Or rethink the additional join fetch from techie to skills. As I explained earlier, you're creating a huge product here. This query that we see here will result in an SQL query that selects all columns mapped by the interview request entity, all columns mapped by the techie entity, and all columns mapped by the skills entity. So there are probably quite a few database columns. And in the from clause, we do an inner join between the interview request and the techie, and a left join between the techie and the skills. That means we get a lot of records back from a result set with a huge projection, and a lot of records back from the database. So how many records will that contain? Well, that's the number of interview requests multiplied by the number of techies multiplied by the number of skills. And these kind of queries are quite often the ones that show up when I help a team to improve the performance of their Hibernate-based application layer. So if these entities map a lot of columns, or if you have a lot of interview requests or techies, then you get a huge result set, and the database query will be slow. The handling on the network might be slower than expected. Normally it's not really slow because our network infrastructure is just incredibly fast nowadays. But the handling in Java application is also slow because Hibernate needs to handle all these result set records, remove the duplicates, at least for the interview requests, and map all of them to complex Java objects, and that just takes time. So yeah, in general, think twice about using more than one or two join fetch clauses. I know here there are just two. And the association between techie and skills will most likely not be too big. I mean, even an experienced developer will probably not have more than, let's say, something between 20 and 30 skills, probably. I mean, at least if that person is realistic with stuff that they think they know something about. And yeah, that maybe you can do the 2 joint fetches here without running into performance issues. But yeah, the only thing you can then do to avoid the duplicates would be to use a set instead of a list. Okay, any more questions? Otherwise, we are now at 3:25 German time, almost an hour in. Then I would, yeah, pasted that one. Okay, I can take a look at this query here, this question here, because that was an easy one. While you have some time to think about if you have a question. And after that, I will end the stream. Okay, querying with joint table ID in JPA without native query. My object is discovery result, many to one join column company. I want a query like this. Select scope from discovery result for company ID. How can I query by ID? Which under company? Okay, yeah. You need to join the discovery result and company entities and then compare the ID column of the company with the company ID parameter. So this is code, and that, and that, and that, and that. And then let's take the query here and provide a quick solution to it. So let's call it R. Let's select R.scope from discovery result R. Join R.company C, where C.id equals company ID grouped by scope. Yeah, that should be it. Post. Dennis asked if it's possible to have non-blocking database connections for reactive programming with Vertex. We're not based on the JDBC specification. JDBC is a blocking API, but there are a few vendor-specific approaches, and there is the R2DBC. R2, how's it called? I think it's R2DBC. Yeah, it's R2DBC. It's a project by the Spring team, and they are working on a reactive database API driver, whatever. That one looks promising. There's support for several databases already, and but it's probably a little early to announce the winner for the next standard for reactive database access, but it looks like R2DBC might be it. Seems to be far ahead of the competition right now. Igor asks if there's an easy way to change database connection during runtime in Spring. What do you mean by changing during runtime? Do you want to change the entries in your connection pool and then and then all new requests will use the new database connection? That would be possible. they have to log into a specific database. Yeah, that might, well, that could at least be possible. I right now don't know how to implement it, but that would at least be possible. What you can't do is you can't change a database connection after you started a Hibernate session. Because that one is directly connected to a database connection, and you can change that. Yeah, but unfortunately, I wouldn't know how to. Well, you would need to manage your database connection probably manually within your application, so without a database connection pool or anything. But then you could set up a database connection, or then you could programmatically create a Hibernate configuration with a connection to that database and use that within your current request. That would work. Yeah. So what you could do is let the user provide the username and password that they want to use to connect to the database, and then manually instantiate a Hibernate configuration. So programmatically with your own code, create a Hibernate connection. No, to create a Hibernate session factory or an entity manager factory, and set the connection data on that factory, and then use it to instantiate an entity manager or a session. Okay, Rotjo asks if do you have a good article on Hibernate persistence context, first level cache? I'm definitely talking about it in the Hibernate performance tuning workshop, but do I have an article on that? Let me check. I think I don't. No. It doesn't look like I have any article about first level cache. No, I'm sorry. Don't have an article about that. You mention it somewhere. Well, probably not. At least not as detailed as you would probably prefer. So maybe we can give a quick summary of how the first level cache, or the persistence context in that case, works. So as long as you don't detach an entity object programmatically, the persistence context or the first level cache, which in the following explanation will be the same, contain all entity objects that you used in your current session. And that means if you're instantiating a new entity object and use it to call the persist method on the entity manager, or if you fetch an entity from the database, or if you traverse an association between entities, then all these entity objects will be part of your first level cache. And whenever Hibernate needs to resolve a reference to an entity object, it first checks the first level cache. So what does resolving a reference to an entity mean? That means if you're calling the find method on your entity manager, Hibernate will first check the first level cache. If you have a to-one association, a lazily fetched to-one association, Hibernate will first check the first level cache if it contains that reference object before it goes to the database. And if you perform a query that returns entities, Hibernate executes the query, gets the result set back, then iterates through the result set, and for each record it first checks if the contained entity is already a managed entity, so if it's already in the first level cache or persistence context. And then it takes it from there instead of the query result. This ensures that you always use the same entity object within your session. which is a great thing. Unfortunately, it also prevents you to get an updated version of a managed entity from the database. The only thing you could do there is to call the detach method to detach that entity from the first server cache, and then you could query it again. But before you call detach, please always make sure to call the flush method first. Because if your entity is dirty, which means if you changed anything on that entity and Hibernate didn't trigger the update statement yet, then Hibernate will just detach that entity without writing the changes to the database. So before you call detach, please always call flush to tell Hibernate, okay, please flush the persistence context, write all pending changes to the database, and after that you can detach one entity or clear the whole persistence context. Yeah, that's the most important. That are the most important things for the first level cache or persistence context. Yeah, that should be it, I think. Okay. Then I would say we end the stream here. Thanks for the question. Thanks for joining. I will be back on next Wednesday at the same time, 2:30 p.m. Central European Summertime. And I'm not exactly sure we will either do the same format again, or I will have a guest to talk about an interesting new release. Not exactly sure if we can do that next week or not. We are still talking. Yeah, so I will announce that soon. After I end this stream, I will definitely schedule the stream for next week, and then we will see if it's just us or if we have a guest that can answer a few interesting questions. Okay, then thank you and have a great day. Bye.